Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Heatwave from 2022. One thing that I immediately have to say here is I think when people are to go into this movie because simply an image of what this movie is to seem to give us, I think people were kind of expecting a risque kind of film, and actually they really try to avoid doing anything risky whatsoever in this movie. The only thing really risky about this film is to be this murder mystery movie that goes in here. Because we play around with the whole like this is an affair movie, but when it comes down to it, there's nothing that seems all that much to just say like, okay, these two characters kind of interested in one another, but like we are just to kind of see this relationship build in a very like, instead of it building in a very like below her mouth kind of way. If anybody is to go on and never seen that movie, and if not, I would probably recommend it. Instead, we kind of get this kind of like friends and benefits kind of way of doing this film, where like people, even if they're skinny dipping, like you see like they kind of crop or cut away, or they kind of do this kind of shifty looking editing where you see nothing, as if this is like the a PG-13 version of an affair film, which doesn't make any sense. um just very like, hey, like let's show some bedroom scenes that are just like girls who are just pushing around some bed sheets and having this dialogue together, and I'm like, okay, so like, but really the fascinating thing about this film is the backstory of our two main characters, but then also that murder mystery. So my main intrigue about this film, once I was like strolling through the trailer, was really we have a guy named Scott Crane in this movie, and his real name is actually Sebastian. I, of course, went on to listen, or really watch and listen, to a YouTube channel called Michael Rosenbaum's Inside of You, or Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. And Sebastian was actually on that show recently. And so Sebastian was talking about his time of, or part of his life when he was to go on and live on a boat for a long stretch of time. And I was like, you know what, like that seems to be like such a like unique like story, that he's gone on a number of years just being on a boat until it seemed that money was to dry up. And so I thought that was rather intriguing. I thought that was really cool. So check out that show. Anyways, so with that said, that's kind of like, for this movie, it's kind of like teeing it up and going on and just like this film. So let's go on. I guess I can tee it up for you guys. So we have a girl named Claire who is to work in this kind of financial business where it seems that Scott Crane is to really want to go on and buy and sell like certain buildings or certain lands and stuff like that, to try to maybe repurpose them, or to try to go and clean them up and to make quite a bit of cash on them, like as if these guys are going on and finding these old condemned houses and cleaning them up and like making a decent living off of it, like house remodel or whatever. So it seems that Claire is to have this very specific thing that she wants to sell to her boss, and it seems that at some point Claire is to finally get this off her chest about this whole thing, and Scott is to, of course, be like, oh yeah, like we should definitely go on with what she has. And so all of a sudden it seems that Claire is working her way up the food chain of being much more successful at her job, and all of a sudden she, of course, is to meet this girl who is to be Eve, and she, of course, is to meet her at this pool, and all of a sudden, both Claire and Eve are having this relationship, and all of a sudden, we have Claire, who is to be told by her boss Scott, it's like, well, hey, like, I'm having a party get together, like, come on, you can come to my house, like, hey, like, all business or all workers or all co-workers can come to my place and we can have this party. All of a sudden, Claire is to go to Scott's house and realize that the girl that she was in love with is also her boss's wife. And so it finds out that we find Eve is actually Genevieve, and so Claire is now distraught by the fact that this girl had lied to her. So Eve is to go on and talk to Claire and mention to her, it's like, well, like, I was being honest with you, I was being truthful with you, and the further and further we go along in here, it seems that at some point Scott may go on and figure or put the pieces together, and that might go on and possibly lead to a possible murder mystery within the story. So, with that said, let's go on to just go into a double 5 time territory, and let's just go into this thing to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, the very beginning of this piece, we find out that Claire was to, of course, lose her family's home via this accidental fire, because we had her landlord, or her, like, her slumlord, as she calls it, go on and just be really bad to her family. And so Claire was to go on and lose her whole entire family in this fire. And so Claire went on and waited till this guy was to fall asleep, and then go through his house with gasoline and a match and burn it down. Claire, 11 years later, I guess, is to go to this, like, refugee halfway house. And so Claire is to go on and make a name for herself in this business. And so, like, Claire is just kind of looking for the next big thing to sell to her boss. And so Claire, it seems, is to go to this hotel and is to hear that there is this Ironside cannery that seems to be up for sale. She's like, ooh, like, what is this woman saying about this new item that's out there? So Claire goes on and is to talk with the guy who owns this hotel, and I guess this guy continues to let Claire go on and sneak in from time to time. I believe it's Manuel. And goes on and lets this girl kind of go into this pool as long as she goes and gives him some certain candy. So it seems that Manuel has noticed through the cameras that there's nobody in this pool, and so he lets Claire go out there. So Claire goes to this pool, and Eve is all of a sudden to skinny dip within this pool, and I'm like, really? Like, she obviously would see that there's a person there, but Eve just kind of skinny dips anyways because she doesn't care. So it seems that we find out that Eve is to own this place because she inherited this. So Claire is to go on, and we have Eve who's like, well, hey, do you live here? So on and so. So Claire is getting a little uncomfortable, especially with a seemingly girl that's wearing nothing in this pool. And so Eve just kind of walks off. So it seems that Eve kind of figures out that Claire is to go in and kind of sneak in, especially when it's hot out, because really the heat wave is to be really focused on the fact that it's to be so hot in the place that they're at. Like supposedly it's 104 degrees or something like that consistently outside, to where it's like, oh my god, like man, we're just dying out here. So it seems that we have Claire that is to have this thing for flames or fire. So Claire is to go on and consistently meet with Eve at this pool, and so and consistently meet in other other places, kind of these rando kind of locations. Um, So, because what happens is Claire is in this dating app, and she's to go on and meet a guy named Arlo. And Claire and Arlo are, of course, uh, going on this date together, and it seems that things are going smoothly. It seems like things are they're connecting, and then all of a sudden Claire is to see Eve, and so both Claire and Eve go to this bathroom, and Claire is asking Eve, like, oh, who is that guy? Like, is he your date? And Claire is like, oh no, like, we're married. And Eve's like, well, where's your wedding ring? And like, around and round we go to where it's like, oh yeah, like, Eve is realizing that this girl doesn't have anybody. And so, like, and Eve's fine with that. So, more and more, Claire realizes that she's going to try and find this girl because she's so intrigued by her. So they go on and continue to meet at this pool. They go and they like exchange numbers, and so they consistently hang out with one another. So it seems that Claire is to desperately want to go on and talk to Scott Crane, because she thinks that she has a really good business opportunity for him to look into. So Claire goes on and is to try and talk to Scott, and mention that she at one point had read his book, and that he like kind of changed her life. And Scott blows her off to just ask somebody like that's on the another part of this like place here, like, oh, are you ready to go for lunch? It's like, yeah. So completely blows her off. So Claire goes on and is to now, because like Scott's completely out of ideas. It seems like nobody can figure out what is the next thing to do as far as buying real estate, or buying certain parts of places. So Claire is to mention that, like, well, hey, there's this Ironside cannery that is looking really good, because it seems that soon there's going to be some traffic heading that way, and it seems that people are going to be scrambling to want to try to repurpose this whole kind of pier section to have it be that this place is going to make a real killing. And Scott is turning to Lane, and Scott's like, well, hey, like, why didn't you think of this? And Claire is like, well, I sent him this as a memo, and I guess he just blew it off. Because Claire was trying to go on and get an appointment with Scott, but Lane was saying, it's like, well, it seems that probably the only time he's going to get you in is by Labor Day. And so that's when Claire went to try to go on and talk with Scott, and he blew her off. So Scott thinks this is a great idea, and so Scott pulls Claire in to oversee this whole buying of this spot, and they're kind of looking through it, and they're like this looks really good, as we kind of see them kind of going. Like, we just see a lot of that going on because we can't actually see what they're saying, because it's probably they are saying like, yeah, like, we're gonna just edit this part out, like, we're just gonna insert music here so you guys can just say whatever you want. And they're like, oh, okay, great, like, this is easy money, yeah. No. So we go on, and it seems that everything is gonna work out here. And so Scott is kind of complaining to Claire about his assistant and how he never has proper grammar when he texts Scott back, mentioning about some appointment, and it's like, so Scott and Claire are, of course, at this dinner together, because, of course, they're kind of spending a lot of time together. So it seems that Scott is to just be more won over by Claire than he is his own assistant. So what ends up happening is Claire is to come in one day, and Scott is to technically get the boot. He is to go and get transferred to some other department, and now Claire is going to be Scott's assistant. So, which is kind of weird. Very weird, because what happens next? So Claire is going on and talking with Scott, and Scott, of course, is saying that his wife is just like, man, she's just a busy bee. Like, she's such a social wallflower, and like, I don't know, I can never really get her. She's just so busy. So we have Scott at one point telling Claire, it's like, well, hey, like, how about this Saturday? Like, all the coworkers can come to my place, and we can just have like a party or a shindig or something like that. And so Scott is telling Claire, it's like, well, hey, like, you can come too, because, like, yeah, just because you're my assistant, like, you can come. So, and Scott is mentioning that his wife will go on and take care of all the planning and whatever. So here comes Saturday, and so now we have this whole party popping off, and Lane is going on and chiseling this thing of ice. And so we have, of course, where Claire is going to meet with Scott's wife, and of course that ends up being the same girl that Claire has been having a now affair with. So Scott is to introduce Eve as Genevieve, and so Claire is just like, well, yeah, like, I've been dating a guy recently, and like, I found out that this guy was kind of an a-hole, and so Claire is just really like disgusted, and so after she is to go on and talk with Genevieve, she just kind of walks off, and we have Eve consistently texting and calling Claire, and she doesn't answer. So Claire goes on to this like boxing or kickboxing session, something like that. So Eve is to follow Claire to this session, and so Eve, of course, was to remember that Claire said that she would go here on a specific day, and so Eve kind of tracks her down, and Claire is still just like, well, like, you have a husband, like, you lied to me. And Eve is like, well, Eve's what is what my mom used to call me, so it just kind of like, it came natural for me to just tell you that I'm Eve. And Eve was telling Claire that it's like, well, hey, like, this wasn't just some like fling. This wasn't like, it feels like I'm really starting to have feelings for you. And so Claire is to eventually admit that she is to feel the same way. So the more and more that they're together, the more and more they're falling head over heels for one another. And so we get to one day where Scott is to be having this phone call, and it seems that his wife is doing something that he's very upset about, and he's flinging furniture around, and looks like he's on a rampage of sorts. So Scott leaves for the day, and so Claire's a little concerned because it's like, okay, like he hasn't called me, he hasn't texted. We of course have one guy who's called Teddy, and Teddy's asking Claire, it's like, well, has he called you recently? Like, has he said anything? And Claire's just like, no. So Claire, of course, is to leave a message on Scott's phone and say, like, well, hey, like, you left early and it's kind of unusual for you. Let me know if you need anything. Like, call me, text me whenever. And so Claire just kind of like leaves that message, and all of a sudden Claire gets a text on her phone saying the words "I know," and it's all lowercase. So Claire is like, "Oh, I know. What does that mean? What does that mean?" So Claire makes her way to go to Scott's house. And it seems weirdly that the door is kind of cracked open. And so Claire is just kind of looking around. It's like, like, is he home? Is he not home? I don't know what's going on. So Claire leaves this place and just doesn't think anything of it. So she goes to work the next day, and all of a sudden there is like detectives that are at this place going on wanting to ask questions. So we have Marlowe and Detective Parker, the same Marlowe guy that, of course, was the date that Claire had X amount of days ago. So, like, Marlowe isn't butthurt about the whole, like, hey, like, you didn't call me back, or you, like, I think he was just kind of fine with it, figuring out that it's like, meh, I guess we weren't really compatible together. So, because at some point they have to go on and they have to question Claire here, because Claire, of course, is Scott's assistant, just kind of asking like what she was to go on and do, which is kind of like a real, like, at this point it's kind of like a review of what exactly she had done through the past part of this movie. So Claire is also to go on and have this rap sheet that also makes her suspicious for this case. And Claire is just like, she comes clean, and she does mention that she did technically have an affair with Eve, but like really in this story, like Claire, like it doesn't really seem like she was to go on and actually kill this man, kill Scott. But they go on and they find some ice pick in Claire's place that is to have, of course, blood of Scott. So, like, yep, that's the smoking gun right there. So it seems that Claire is to get set up, and she needs to figure out why. And so she's trying to run away from the police, as we have Manuel telling Claire that the police are coming to her place. So Claire is just kind of jumping off from these fire escapes and whatever to try to run from these police. And we have Detective Parker that's going like, oh, I really like this girl. So Claire is running off, and so she needs to figure out how she can go on and implement Eve in all of this instead of herself. Because supposedly, Eve, if she was to have had her husband die, Eve was to have done a prenuptial agreement, so Eve wasn't to get anything. But come to find out, it seems that Claire is to find out information about Eve. That it seemed that Scott, when Scott was talking to Claire, Scott had mentioned how Scott's previous wife was very rich, and it seemed that Scott's wife had died, and then of course Scott inherited all of this money. So Scott, of course, was to immediately, I guess, after this, find Eve and I guess sign the prenuptial agreement intelligently, right? So, come to find out, Eve was to be taking advantage of Scott, and it seems that there were certain parts of land or businesses that were desperately wanting to sell their places or selling their locations. And it seems that Eve was going on and trying to find certain people that she could work with to try and sell these things. And so, we find out that Eve is to call, the Ironside cannery guy and mention, well, hey, um, did you know, Eve at all before this? And the Ironside guy is saying, well, Eve was to tell me that she was going to set up a buyer, and the Ironside guy just naturally assumed that the people that were coming next was Claire and Scott. He naturally assumed that's who they were. So it seemed that Eve already set this up, and so we have Claire that's just going on and realizing that Eve, through her bank accounts, was to get these kind of finder's fees, and Claire is really realizing that Eve was to start to stack up on the dough and take full advantage of all of these kind of shady deals that she was kind of doing without either the buyer or seller realizing it. So she was taking credit for a lot of stuff. So we have Claire that is to go on and find Arlo and present him with all of this evidence that it seems that it was possible that Claire was to have killed Scott's first wife so that way Scott could get all the inheritance from her, and then Eve was trying to figure out a way to swindle Scott so that way she can make a decent living, so that way she can kill off Scott. And Claire was to also figure out that Detective Parker was to be involved in Scott's first wife's case, and that Detective Parker had a sick wife dealing with cancer, and so I guess Scott was fitting the bill for Detective Parker's wife's cancer, which turned out she died anyways. And so we have at one point that Claire is to kind of figure out all this story in her head, and so now, with the help of Arlo, because Claire goes to Arlo and is to have all this stacked up motives or evidence and all this stuff. So they go on and they're working with this story. So Claire calls Detective Parker and is to mention, it's well, hey, it seems like you're a police officer that likes to do deals, and I know full well about that. So you can go on and have a deal with me. And Detective Parker's well, I don't know what you're talking about. So all of a sudden we go on, and after Detective Parker is done talking with Claire, Detective Parker calls Arlo, and because we clichéishly enough have the older detective that's working with Arlo who's saying like, "Well, hey man, I'm close to retiring." I'm like, of course you always have like a veteran with a rookie cop, and that veteran always is like so close to retirement he can taste the retirement and so on and so forth. And his immediate thing of like, well, hey, like they can't go on and give me crap because what am I going to do? Just pull my retirement earlier? Like, what are they going to do? Fire me? Like that kind of thing throughout this film. So Detective Parker calls Arlo and is to mention it's like, well, hey, like, you know what? Sometimes like you, like Arlo, you get under my skin, but you're a good cop. And so like it feels like Detective Parker is telling Arlo goodbye, oddly. So we have Detective Parker leave this area, and Arlo and Claire are kind of watching from his house, and so they follow him. They follow him to this location where Claire is going to talk to Detective Parker and figure out how to get some more evidence on Detective Parker. But it seems that Detective Parker is to find both Arlo and Claire parked in this environment. And so Parker shoots Arlo and then grabs Claire and then brings her in here. So we end up finding out who the actual murderer is now. We find out that the actual murderer was Lane, Scott's old assistant. Because we had Lane who had mentioned before that like it was nice for him to go and have Claire take his position because Lane is going to focus on his sick father, who I guess is not really doing well. So, come to find out, Lane had motive to try and have Claire be fitted the bill for this murder because Lane, of course, was to be the son of the slumlord that that of course Claire tried to kill in the beginning part of this movie. And so Lane was to try to get even with her by setting her up this whole entire time, trying to get her this job, so that way he can kind of get even with this girl. So we find out that uh, that Lane was to be with Scott as he died and shoved the ice pick into this guy's body. And then, of course, Lane was to text to Claire the words, "I know." And we had Claire realize that because it's like, oh, like Scott, of course, liked to do like really good grammar and stuff like that. Whereas Lane like couldn't have been bothered. So Claire now is to put that together. So we have, of course, within this movie that Claire is to fight with Lane, and Lane is to die here by Claire's hands. Of course, kind of wrestling with this gun, and Claire ends up shooting Lane. All of a sudden, Parker is to come in with this gun, and we have Eve who smacks Parker over the head with his fire extinguisher. And so now it seems that Claire is going to go on and kill like Eve to just kind of finish this whole thing up. So we have it here where Eve is to kind of come clean, and it's to just kind of mention it's like, well, she's been trying this whole time to like work work over Scott here, because at first, like, it did seem like love, but then all of a sudden we started to really see in this film that that Eve was mentioning that, like, Scott, like, wasn't really there for her, that we see that this relationship was really falling apart. So, or that they were just kind of using one another for the longest time. So we have Eve still mentioning to Claire, it's like, you know what, like, this wasn't all like a game. I really do love you. And Claire is like, well, like, I love you too. So it doesn't definitively seem that Claire is to go on and kill Eve here. It just feels like Eve might walk off. And then we just kind of transition to Claire going on and getting this woman to pay her this big massive check of like $7,000. And this woman is telling Claire, it's like, well, hey, what are you going to do next? And Claire is like, well, you know what? I think I'm going to go and invest in certain places, certain businesses, and certain like parts of land. And this girl's like, yeah, I can see that, especially with how, like, going on, that's basically what she had done, um, like, before, within the last job she had. So we go on, and that's kind of like how the movie ends, with just Claire just going on and doing exactly what she was doing with this job, but now she's going to go on and, with this like small amount of money, just go on and try to like make a life for herself. So while also kind of reflecting on her past and stuff like that. So with that said, I think I'm going to go out of my way to just go on and get out of here. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about Heatwave, or probably this review. That's okay, because at the end of the day, yeah, this was one of those films where it was just an okay film. It was just like, there's a lot of like cliche-ish kind of things going on here. There's just a lot of just approaches that I'm just kind of like about. But I think some people might get something out of this, but really what they probably originally came in here for, they'll probably left just kind of disappointed. So that said, I think I'm going to get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, buddy.